Hi, so this is our Management 489 team project, and this is our group members. Currently, Laura is not with us. She's having some technical difficulties, so she will be recording for her part of the presentation here shortly, and we'll have to submit this together at some point. So to move into our presentation, we are doing the automotive industry, and below we have our selected firms. Adria has chosen to do Honda, Dwayne has chosen to focus on Ford, I've chosen to write on Stellantis, and Laura has chosen to write on Toyota. So starting off with my firm, Stellantis, going into a quick analysis of Porter's five forces. So just to preface, competitive industry and bargaining power of buyers is going to be pretty similar across the board for all of us, given that it's the automotive industry and that there's just a few aspects of it that are pretty much just industry wide. And I'll get into that now here as I'm going to be focusing on these dimensions. So starting with competitive rivalry. It's extremely high in the automotive industry, given that it's very saturated, especially globally, with a lot of different competitors. And Stellantis itself does currently hold some pretty good positions in the SUV and minivan segment. SUV specifically, something like the Dodge Durango has been very popular for Stellantis, and minivan, something like the Chrysler Pacifica, has been very popular. And both of those have a very large market share within those segments. And something that Stellantis has been focusing on really recently is transition to EV and hybrid uh, powertrains, which has increased its pressure from its rivals, given that there's more EV companies that have been starting to pop up. And it's something kind of related to the following dimension. Threat of new entrants is very low, given that it's extremely expensive to start up automotive industry, whereas something else like a smaller business is a lot easier to start up. There isn't a lot of upfront costs. It's extremely expensive for car companies to just come out of the blue, especially considering things like factory costs, development costs, marketing costs, R&D costs. You can hire talent from outside competitors, but um, putting aside non-compete clauses for employees, it's still pretty hard for companies to just come out of nowhere and be successful with the new vehicle companies or car companies, I should say. Threat of new entrants is again pretty low. Oh, just keep continuing that portion. There's very limited success among EV startups. Tesla is a company that has been a pretty rare standout. That Lucid and Rivian have also been pretty successful startups in terms of their product offerings and the segment that they control within the EV market. And it's something that Stellantis hopes to improve upon and kind of take some of that market share back, given that internal combustion engines, they kind of have their lane, but they want to move in on the EV industry and kind of take on that. And tariffs are still preventing foreign automakers like BYD from gaining ground. And just to preface, I had recently, in a previous semester, written about China for an international business class with Professor Tuttle. And BYD was a very notable company, given that it's very easy for it to gain ground because it's had a lot of support from the Chinese government, and it'd be as if Ford had a lot of support from the U.S. government, and there were laws and regulations that made it so that, for example, government vehicles or buses or public transport had to be Ford branded and Ford created. So it definitely helps BYD in terms of being able to know that it has demand and things like mandates that are a lot friendlier towards BYD vehicle drivers or in China make it so that it's a lot more successful than something like Ford might be in the US, given that it doesn't have that same backing from its government. But that's a whole other aspect of outside threats. And bargaining power of suppliers is pretty moderate, and it kind of depends. I mean, it's all over the the I guess it's all over the place in terms of what suppliers we're talking about, given that some countries have a lot more regulation than others, and um, Stellantis is a lot more reliant on some. It's very reliant on global suppliers for things like raw materials and electronics. Talking about China a little bit previously, electronics is a very big uh, sector, I guess, where global suppliers are from for Stellantis, and it's continuing to increase as EV demand rises for the company. Given that it has to create new supplier relations, it's not the easiest thing for the company to go ahead and make new relations with all of these EV part manufacturers and suppliers. So it's something that'll prove to be a little bit difficult for the company in the future. And strong EV focused partnerships are going to be important for the company moving forward because they have pretty solid relationships, I would say, for the majority of their internal combustion engine suppliers. But given that this is new uncharted territory for the company, it's going to be a little bit different of a ball game and a little bit harder for the company. So I could see something like this in terms of bargaining power for suppliers becoming a little bit more high in the future, depending on how successful they are in, keeping strong partnerships with different suppliers. But, that's for the future. Bargaining power of buyers, again, is something that is kind of just standard across the automotive industry, given that there's a lot of alternatives, in terms of body styles. Do you want to drive a truck, a sedan, hatchback, crossover, an SUV? Or do you want, powertrains? Do you want an internal combustion engine? Do you want a hybrid powered car? Do you want an EV? Do you want even something like a hydrogen, which Toyota has started to touch on recently here with the Toyota Mirai, and some companies are starting to develop hydrogen power for commercial vehicles. So, there's a lot of different options for consumers, and whether that be people who are just like, just regular consumers that aren't on a business level, or businesses again, focusing on hydrogen technology. And specifically for Stellantis, high prices are something that can alienate cost-sensitive or compact car buyers. It's if you look at the Ford website or the Chevy website, GMC website, and then you go and look at Stellantis brands like Dodge, Ram, Jeep, uh, Chrysler. It's if you compare the prices, it's just not very, for the most part, not all vehicles, but a lot of these vehicles, Stellantis is a little bit more expensive, and I would say across the board, they don't offer a lot more features. Some things like Jeep are kind of features in and of themselves, given that they have their own culture and brand reputation. So it's a little bit different. Threat of substitutes is a little bit more low, and it's kind of moderate in some aspects, given, again, depending on the region, uh, or I guess for consumers, depending on the region. If you're somewhere where there's a lot of public transport, it's probably not even something that you might consider. You might not even get a vehicle to begin with. But focusing more on the U.S., it's a little bit more low and moderate, unless you live in a city or somewhere that just so happens to have a much more walkable city or downtown area, you're probably going to be buying a vehicle. Chinese EVs kind of represent a long-term price-based substitution risk, given that if in the future at some point, on this next point here, if in the future that they're not barred by tariffs, it's something that could be a threat to not only Stellantis, but any other domestic company that wants to transition towards EV technology. And then moving on to the VRIN and value chain analysis. Value chain is not on this portion, it's on our papers, but we chose to give a few aspects or never mind, actually, the value chain aspects are here, but a VRIN analysis is on the paper. I got it mixed up. So in terms of logistics for Stellantis, strong supplier and dealership networks exist to help support scale. It's very easy for them to, I guess, transport their vehicles from dealer to dealer, and given a few of their internal combustion engine supplier networks, it's just helps us support that. And then again, for battery suppliers, it's kind of something that weakens them, and especially with their new approach to this to EV technology, it's something that kind of weakens the uniqueness, especially when you compare it to something like Tesla or Lucid or Rivian. And operations are a little bit more weak to moderate, given things like automation and supplier ties. It helps them be a little bit more efficient and effective in their manufacturing. But a few of their methods are pretty common across the industry. And considering things like tier one, tier two, and tier three suppliers that exist for the company, it's very common for those tiers to also supply or other companies, I should say. I actually have some firsthand knowledge, given that one of my manufacturing internships was actually in a factory that supplied both Ford, Stellantis, and GM for a little bit, but Ford and Stellantis. Procurement, it's a pretty weak competitive advantage. Again, solid supplier agreements exist for key components, which in terms of like other agreements for things that aren't as important, it's pretty hard for them to keep a good solid supplier agreement. And then moving on to marketing and sales, again, kind of touching on their iconic brands like Jeep, Ram. It's extremely they have an extremely loyal fan base, so it's something that is, I would say, pretty unique to the brand. They're pretty price sensitive market in EV, or they're right. Let me move on here. Wide service network and free to move has been something that has been pretty helpful in terms of their service and aftermarket. Competitive advantage free to move is a vehicle share service, and subscription models and EV servicing are not unique or mature for the company, so kind of brings it down. So, things like free to move are a little bit better, and their service and aftermarket is pretty solid as well. Research and development is kind of weak to moderate. In terms of EV, I would say it's probably not as strong as something like their internal combustion engines, but it's something that they're focusing on and improving. And I'll move it onto Adria.
Hi, I'm Adria, and the firm that I chose to research for the automotive industry was Honda. So just taking a look at the Porter's five-dimension analysis for Honda here, the competitive rivalry is high. There's a lot of competition within the automotive industry. Honda has to compete with key players, including Toyota, Ford, Volkswagen, and many others as well. Key drivers of competition include innovation, brand loyalty, and pricing. When it comes to threat of new entrants, that is on the lower side. The automotive industry's barriers to entry are very high. That's largely because of the high capital investment that's needed. There's significant financial resources that are required in order to enter the market. For bargaining power of suppliers, that is moderate for Honda. Honda experiences a balanced level of supplier power, and specialized components, including semiconductors, for example, give certain suppliers a little bit more leverage here. Continuing on with the Porter's five-dimensional analysis, bargaining power of buyers is moderate to high for Honda. Consumers can easily compare prices and features across brands like Toyota, Ford, and Hyundai. The impact of brand loyalty and product differentiation is important here as well. Brand loyalty, product differences, and customer service can reduce consumers' bargaining power. When it comes to threat of substitutes, that is moderate as well. Alternatives to personal cars can present a moderate level of a threat. Substitute alternatives like public transit, car sharing services, and electric scooters offer alternatives to owning a personal vehicle as well. So here is just a little analysis combining the VRIN and value chain. When it comes to logistics, there is a moderate competitive advantage here. Honda has a strong supplier network and vast dealership network as well. Other automakers have similar networks, which kind of takes away from Honda's competitive edge there. When it comes to operations, it has a weak to moderate competitive advantage. They have strong service networks, warranties, and an established aftermarket. However, competitors can offer similar services. For procurement, there is a weak competitive advantage here, similar to the operations. As I mentioned, Honda has strong service networks, warranties, and an aftermarket business, but competitors can also offer similar services, especially in the EV market, where Honda is kind of falling behind in certain ways. Moving on to marketing and sales, Honda has a moderate competitive advantage. They have a very strong brand and reputation, which drives loyalty. However, competitors can offer similar products at competitive prices, especially with EVs. For service and aftermarket, they have a moderate competitive advantage. They have strong service networks, warranties, and aftermarket business, as I previously mentioned. However, they're not a non-substitutable business as many automakers offer similar services. For research and development, they have a moderate competitive advantage. They invest heavily in hybrid, electric, and autonomous driving technologies. I know that they make a hybrid version of the Accord, as well as the Civic, and I believe the CRV. Honda focuses on hybrids and fuel efficiency, which makes it a bit unique, but Toyota and Tesla are also advancing in these areas as well.
Hi, and my name is Dwayne, and I'm gonna give you the last firm. So I chose Ford for mine. And going into Porter's five-dimension analysis of Ford, I found that the competitive rivalry of Ford is very high, similar to Adria and Diego mentioned that this is the automotive industry that Ford is operating in, and Ford must compete on a global scale in a competitive industry. So all of the different players in the automotive industry are all vying for like the same audiences and the same customer base. And with cars being fairly big ticket items, it makes the competition even fiercer. Also, to go along with that, the competitive rivalry of Ford is high because Ford must stay on top of all the technological advances in the automotive industry. So, for example, if a competitor like Stellantis or a Toyota offers something that Ford can't, like a specific vehicle type or like a specific type of electric vehicle, Ford loses that potential sale, which would be a problem. So, they have to stay on top of both of those things, so it makes that competitive rivalry very high. The threat of new entrants for Ford is relatively low. So, since Ford has a long history of automotive manufacturing, and just how Diego and Adria previously mentioned, the barriers of competing in the automotive industry are incredibly high. This makes Ford's threat of new entrants pretty low. Also, to go along with that, Ford has built a strong and loyal consumer base that has also extensive connections within the automotive industry as well, with Ford being such a top player. So that makes, Ford really doesn't have to worry about, new players coming into the industry because they're more than well established. Also, the bargaining power of suppliers for Ford is also relatively low. It can be argued in certain aspects that the bargaining power of suppliers could be more moderate for a certain car part. So, like for example, if a supplier is supplying engines versus a supplier who is, doing like the knobs or like a rear view mirror, for example, the supplier that is supplying the engine can have more bargaining power because that's a more critical part of a vehicle, whereas, if you're a supplier and you're offering another part that other, auto companies are, there's a lot more. You don't have as much bargaining power there. It's easy for Ford to find a different supplier. Also, in general, if you are an automobile, supplier, you can't make a whole part, just from an engine or even just a rearview mirror, of course. So that protects Ford as being, like the total kind of like automobile manufacturing, because they have to take all these parts and put it together at the end of the day. So, that kind of, lessens the bargaining power of the suppliers. And also, to further this, Ford also takes special measures to make sure they're using like a variety of suppliers from, around the globe. So, they're not just sticking to like one over here, like one over here. All of their, supplies are coming from a specific place. They have it all kind of mixed up so that, the power isn't, unevenly distributed in one supplier's hands or the other. So, furthermore, going into some more of these dimensions, um, the bargaining power of the buyers, on the other hand, is relatively high. So since the automotive industry is so competitive, it's really kind of in the buyer's hands to kind of choose which brand they're going to purchase a vehicle from. So also, to go along with this, the cost of switching car brands doesn't cost you any more than a car itself. So that makes it relatively easy for a consumer to be swayed to purchase a different car from a different brand on their next vehicle purchase. So not only getting a consumer to buy, the initial vehicle, but also keeping them loyal to your brand is very, very important for Ford and other car manufacturers as well. So that's, kind of, furthers the argument of why the bargaining power of the buyers is very high. And also the automobile, manufacturing industry is very much so influenced by the preference of the consumers. Whether consumers want to buy electric vehicles or not, what kind of features are consumers looking in a vehicle? Like, since these car brands, including Ford, had to kind of play to that, it makes the bargaining power of the buyers very high. And lastly, the threat of substitutes is actually a moderate threat. So, Ford faces a moderate threat in the form of substitutes such as alternative modes of transportation, such as like bicycles, walking, motorcycles. So that's going to be a constant threat for any kind of manufacturing brand. Is what are the consumers, if they're not using cars, how are they getting from point A to point B? Also, to go along with that, the gases produced by individuals driving cars every day have very negative effects on our environment. So we live in a country where people have to drive to get to point A to point B, which is good for car brands, but bad for the environment. And this kind of, divide is why the threat of substitutes is a moderate threat for Ford. Then also the effect of people actually going ahead to switch to these alternative commuting methods, as well as just buying few cars in general, as the economy isn't doing so hot. So instead of having two, three cars in the garage, a lot of families might have to downsize to one. So that is why the threat of the substitutes is going to be a moderate threat for Ford. And furthermore, doing the analysis, combining the VRIN and value chain, in terms of logistics, getting parts and supplies to point A to point B, Ford has a very strong competitive advantages coming from that, because not only does Ford have a robust and extensive, logistics supply because they've just been established for so long, but they just have so many deep connections to like things like suppliers and whatnot and shipping things in the industry that it just makes them a key player and gives them a very strong competitive advantage in that aspect. So next, going into operations, Ford also has a moderate competitive advantage in that aspect as well. You know, Ford has a very large scale and global operations chains with suppliers and, companies and all kinds of things all around the world. So with all that being carried out, it's very, very difficult for them, for another firm to like substitute that for something else. So that gives them a very moderate competitive advantage. Also, in terms of procurement, they have a very strong competitive advantage in that aspect as well. Having a strong connection again with a network of global suppliers, as well as having a long-standing relationships with those suppliers, gives Ford, they can really kind of strike the good deals. They can get the low prices, and that also influences the price of cars in general, which has an effect on the whole automotive industry. So that's very interesting. In terms of marketing and sales, since again Ford has been established for so long, there's like Ford families. Like, you drive a Ford, your grandma drive a Ford, like everyone before you, we only buy Ford vehicles. And having that kind of very strong, really deep kind of sense of like brand imagery to market it takes years and years and years. And that also shows that you have very, good, your consumers really trust you. And that's very, very hard to duplicate. So that gives them a very strong competitive advantage in the market. In terms of services and aftermarket, I believe Adrian Diego also touched upon this, is that it gives them a moderate competitive advantage in the sense that their service and aftermarket is very, very good. But on the other hand, other firms can, replicate this. It's not necessarily impossible, but it could be done. So only a moderate competitive advantage in that aspect. And in terms of research and development, they have a very strong competitive advantage. Due to Ford being so big in the industry, they have the capital to put a lot into their research and development, into their vehicles and upcoming, technological advancements in the automotive industry. So that's a really good thing for them. So I would say that gives them a very strong competitive advantage.
Here is a bit of an overview of the important problems, challenges, and opportunities for each firm. For Honda, its main problem is slow EV adoption and supply chain issues. A challenge that it faces is transitions to EVs. There's a lot of competition from Tesla specifically. Opportunities would be EV expansion, emerging markets, and hybrid tech. Moving on to Ford, their problem is lagging EV range and high production costs. Their challenge is transitions to EVs, competition in trucks, and their opportunities is electric trucks like the F-150 Lightning and global EV growth. For Toyota, its problem is, like many of the others, slow EV transition, hybrid reliance as well. Its challenge is strong competition and emissions regulation, and its opportunities is hybrid leadership, hydrogen tech, and new EVs. Lastly, for Stellantis, their problem here is high reliance on traditional models, and the challenge that they face, like many of the other firms, is EV transition, diverse brand integration, and lastly, their opportunity is EV growth and expanding global reach.
So some of the alternative solutions for our firms, they're all going to be related to adopting or really transforming or improving upon their electric vehicles in terms of each brand. So in terms of Honda, they should accelerate a shift to electric vehicles by forming strategic partnerships, focusing on affordable EV models to compete with Tesla and expanding key markets like North America and Europe. For Ford, they should prioritize expanding its electric truck lineup, especially the Ford F-150 Lightning, and invest in battery technology to improve range and reduce production costs, ensuring it remains competitive in the EV market. For Toyota, they must speed up their EV transition, focusing on expanding the BZ series to compete with industry leaders like Tesla while remaining in global presence in the evolving market. And then lastly, for Stellantis, they should invest in a unified EV platform across its brands, concentrating on electric SUVs and crossovers to streamline production and strengthen its position in the growing global EV market.
All right, and that ends our presentation. Thank you.
Hi, this is Laura Shepley. I am part of Team 4 for our strategic analysis project, and my firm for our under our automotive industry, I picked Toyota. So getting into this, we will start off with the Porter's 5-dimension analysis. So when it comes to competitive rivalry in Toyota's motor company, they hold a strong brand name already, but we mainly can focus on their efficient supply chain and maintaining the high competition with their lean production systems. When it comes to threat of new entrants in just the automotive industry in general, there's always high entry barriers. It's gonna require a large amount of capital investment, especially in a larger scale industry like that. So the threat of new entrants is low. Bargaining power suppliers is also low due to the fact that Toyota has one of the strongest long-term supplier relationships in the automotive industry. Using the just-in-time systems, it reduces the supplier's power, but due to the fact that they have an extremely strong relationship and mutual development between the two, the only things affecting the bargaining power would be instances like equipment or material shortages that affect both the supplier and the company. Now, bargaining power of buyers is moderate to high. With the new technology coming out and electric vehicles now coming into motion in the industry, Toyota has to keep up on their innovations, which they are fairly well at. Due to the fact that the consumers have so many options available to them and can look into the data behind the products, this gives them a little bit more power over the actual company. Although Toyota still remains one of the tops of their market. Now, threats of substitutes, obviously, for when it comes to automotive industry, will always be alternative transportations or alternative technologies. For example, those who have not even invested in electric vehicles yet, they are going to be way further behind than the rest, as well as those who don't take into consideration the public and alternative transportations around which they are marketing their product, their cars. So it stands as a constant threat, but the threat of substitutes is still just moderate. So now we are going to talk about the analysis of the VRIN and value chain combined. When looking at the logistics of the company, they use the just-in-time system, reduces waste, lowers inventory costs by producing what you need when you need it, saves the company so much money. Toyota also, like I said previously, has an extremely well relationship with their suppliers. They are in long-term contracts with them. It's very hard to imitate the relationships that they have made with their suppliers, which puts them more further ahead in competitive rivalry due to the fact that it just shows cost leadership in the market, and especially with the lean operation system they've been relying on for the past couple of years now, has definitely helped with their competitive advantage. Now, in the operations factor, Toyota's production systems is extremely efficient, focused mainly on cost reduction. Although it's not the most difficult to replicate, what's going to be hard to replicate in this sense is their history and the strategies that they used throughout the years that went under decades of refinement to be what it is today as the operational structure it gives Toyota. Not many other firms can perform with the same levels. So this gives Toyota a very high competitive advantage. Now, when talking about procurement, it is a moderate advantage. Long-term supplier partnerships really enable the cost control in this company as well as keeping it stable. And that's what's going to be hard to copy in these other firms, especially new entry firms. Like, for example, Tesla, they're going to have to make new relationships with other companies, and it's going to take much more time to establish a relationship just as trusted as these companies like Toyota, Honda, any of them, Ford, GM. Now, when it comes to marketing sales, it's very low in competitive advantage. They do not focus too much into their marketing and sales. They do have a strong global brand reputation already, so they don't have to worry as much as, say, a new entry company or one that's older and just has fell off the market more. They do strive for customer loyalty, and their brand equity and the loyalties they have already formed while being in the industry for so long can't be as easily copied as, or even just obtained. It's going to take time for any other company. Now, looking at service and aftermarket, it's also low to moderate. It's not a hard system. Many other companies go off of like the lean production system, which has increased their sales and cost control entirely. But what really helps the service factor in Toyota's company is the customer satisfaction that they focus on. They have reliable support for their consumers, and it's a large service network. Now, on the other hand, a lot of companies offer the same exact thing, but Toyota is much older, has been in the industry for a while now, so they are reliable. And it's going to be harder for other firms to prove their reliableness compared to one as Toyota. Now, R&D is extremely high with Toyota. They are solely focused on fuel cell technologies at the moment. With the rise of electric vehicles, their main focus is to get them out on the market before other companies. And it's going to be harder for other companies to do it as good as one such as Toyota or another larger company in the market because of its history, and they already have formed long-term patents to focus solely on the fuel cell technology. It's been one of their main focuses for a while now. And Toyota is the leader of innovation. It's going to be extremely hard to imitate any of their systems or newer technologies by just a short-term contract. It's going to take thought, many strategic analysis, and planning to achieve to where the status of innovation Toyota is achieving right now. All right, well, thank you.